Welcome to this week's UEN Capital Update video. I'm Margaret Buckton, your UEN Executive Director. Well, on today's agenda, they closed out Thursday with House action on school funding. They send 2% back to the Senate. It's the funnel week, and we have some survivors. I call them the good, the bad, and the ugly. What's next? The Senate's going to respond to the House's school funding proposal, and a property tax subcommittee is scheduled for next Wednesday. Advocacy actions this week. We're going to shift a little bit to property taxes and remind legislators that low SSA should quell unfunded mandates. So the House had a strike after amendment, which means they completely rewrite the bill that came over to them from the Senate. It's Senate File 2201, and their amendment set a 2% increase in the regular program district cost per pupil and also applied to the categorical per pupil amounts. That 2% is really no surprise. It's halfway between the 1.75% that the Senate had passed and the 2.25% that the House had proposed in the Appropriations Committee. The bill continues the property tax replacement payments. It will begin July 1st of 2026, but for the first time, they extend that indefinitely into the future and apply it to all future years. The bill states that Iowa Code 257.8, which is the 30-day deadline for action on school funding after the governor's budget, does not apply to this bill. They limit transportation equity payments to no more than $1 million per district. This truly disadvantages two UEN districts, both Waterloo and Council Bluffs, but it won't just apply to the UEN going forward. Davis County, a very large rural district, is already at $900,000 in their payment, and their enrollment is declining. So we would expect to see other districts capped by that $1 million down the road. The state picks up the tab for budget guarantee. That leaves 199 districts who would get less funding than 1%. So in a normal year, their property taxes would go up to pay for that. Well, the state chooses in this case to pay $42 million to relieve property taxes instead of giving that to SSA increases for students. They do have a $7 million appropriation in there for education support personnel supplemental salary. It's prorated based on enrollment, and again, it's a compromise. The House had wanted $14 million, the Senate wanted none. They changed the way that enrollment is going to form your budget for the next year. They require the Department of Education to complete certified enrollment no later than 30 days after the October count date. We're skeptical if that's possible. Then they set a second count date for January 15th that has to be certified to the department by January 30th and require the DE to get that January certified count to the Department of Management in just 21 days. Again, we're skeptical. They set basic enrollment for the budgets as the average of those two counts and require the department to notify a school district if they have any discrepancies or if they dispute the enrollment that was submitted by your district, and they give the district 5 days to respond. This second count date process is enacted for school budget years beginning on or after July 1st of 2027. They also require state aid to be paid quarterly, beginning in July of the fiscal year rather than monthly payments starting in September. And this might help school districts with cash flow. However, it requires the Department of Management to consider the financial position of the state and other factors. So if the state revenues go south, there's not a guarantee that they would be able to keep up with the quarterly payments. So a funnel deadline, which means there were a ton of committee meetings this week, and we're just going to share a couple of these, but look at that weekly report in detail, which includes not just the education committees in the House and Senate, but several other committees that also pass bills that impact you. So for the UEN, we have several bills that we think could help school districts long term. The first one, House File 2029, would allow schools to participate in the state health insurance pool. And it allows the district to apply to the Department of Administrative Services for coverage under that state health insurance plan for district employees. That's effective a year out beginning July 1st of 2027, and there will be lots of details and estimates as to whether or not it could actually save districts. Senate File 2116 applies to open enrolled truants. So it requires that any students who are identified for chronic absenteeism interventions would not be allowed to open enroll out of their district of residence until the attendance and truancy concerns are corrected. House File 2393 is something that UEN actually requested. It is a categorical funding flexibility for students that have education savings accounts who generate that funding for the resident district. So it would allow the school to use that categorical funding for teacher salary supplement, teacher leadership and compensation, and professional development for any general fund purpose, rather than having to go through any process of a flexibility account or something else. That was actually in UEN's legislative choice, school choice priority for 2026. House File 2621 is a mixed bag. We actually support the first part of it regarding local elections, which allows bond elections in June and also fixes that error that prohibited the school bond election in 1 November from including both thresholds of the $4.05 and $2.70 bond thresholds. That part is in the UEN legislative priorities for 2026. However, there's a second part of the bill that moves local elections for all political subdivisions, including school boards and cities and counties and others, to the November general election in even-numbered years. So school boards will be on the ballot with the governor and legislators and even presidential elections. It provides for a transition of terms. We have concerns that the school board election will kind of get lost in all the noise of those larger elections, and it'll make the ballot really long, and voters sometimes don't get to the end. So those were the good things. I'd say these are the bad things. We're disappointed in the SSA rate of 2%, especially with that $1 million limit on transportation equity funding that impacts Waterloo and Council Bluffs. We're disappointed that they spend $42 million on property tax relief through the budget guarantee instead of having a higher SSA rate, which really would have helped students and lowered special ed deficits and provided more for English language learners. There's a long list of unfunded mandates that will require more administrative time, work, reporting, and training that have no funding. And look to your weekly report for some of those listed this week, and we'll probably have to finish up with those next week too. So when we get to the ugly, I'm going to talk about charter school bills and other school choice. Both the House and Senate Education Committees passed identical bills on charter schools this week. And before we get into this, just a little caveat that charters are public schools, and they do have to abide by several regulations in Iowa code, and they have to admit students who apply. Some of them truly help students who maybe weren't served well in a traditional economic or traditional school environment. They are, however, relieved from many mandates and should be able to operate more efficiently. Nationally, about 50% of charter schools close within 5 years. Our objections center on creating a public school district disadvantage when money doesn't come back to the public school district or when it's diverted from the public school district to the charter schools. So under that context, we'll start with the governor's charter school bills, both the House and Senate. These require that teacher salary supplement, state cost per pupil, be paid to the resident by the resident district to the charter school. And as you know, over the last 2 years, the formula to determine TSS for local school districts wasn't based on students. It was based on the number of teachers you had who were below the new mandated minimums. And in many cases, charter school students were already in those charter schools when they did that calculation. It requires that media and education services funding be deducted by the Department of Management and paid to the charter schools. It requires AEAs to provide media and education services to the charter schools, and we're concerned that the AEAs may not be offering those services anymore. Concurrent enrollment. It allows charter school students to access community college courses through public schools. And although that would generate supplementary weighting, in most cases that weighting is not sufficient to pay the cost that public school districts pay to the community colleges for that credit. And then lastly, it allows charter schools to participate in sports and extracurricular activities at a public high school with no money coming back to the public high school. And at our public schools, we pay for that out of the regular program district cost. It also requires public schools to make driver's education available to the charter schools. Now, there are two other bills that I really call charter schools plus. In addition to all those provisions in the governor's bill, they go even further. Regarding IPERS, they make charter employees eligible for IPERS, and there was an amendment in both committees that required the charters to meet the federal IRS requirements for IPERS eligibility, which they needed to do. Facilities, they come up with new infrastructure funding options through the Iowa Finance Authority and new bonding provisions, and it's not just for charters, it's also for accredited non-public schools. They changed preschool. It authorizes community-based providers to participate in 4-year-old preschool programs and to receive state aid. But there's a provision in there that no school or state has authority over those programs to assure that standards are met. They change application deadlines for education savings account. They allow a second application for a student to qualify for an education savings account and be enrolled in a private school for second semester. The start date. Although the bills originally would have allowed both private and public schools to start a week earlier than the current start date, it's disappointing that that was amended out of the bill in both committees. There is a study that we support directing the Department of Education to establish a task force to actually study health-related teacher training requirements and make recommendations, which we thought would have come out of the task force last year, but nothing came out of that, so they really need to dig in. Oh, and there are other homeschool tax incentive expansions, one that would give parents a $4,000 tax credit per child to homeschool. And it's disappointing that, first of all, that they would provide a financial incentive to keep kids at home, but that it only applies to new homeschool situations where maybe parents aren't that committed to the homeschool environment. So what's next? Well, SSA, the school funding bill, goes back over to the Senate. Floor work on all of these bills coming out of committees will begin in earnest. And just because bills cleared a committee threshold doesn't mean that they will have the support in the full House or Senate to move to the other side. Meanwhile, a subcommittee on the governor's property tax reform or relief bill is scheduled next Wednesday in the Senate, and things there have been kind of quiet. So we're going to shift our advocacy actions this week back to property tax reform advocacy and remind all legislators that low SSA with declining enrollment means budget cuts. So we really have to resist any unfunded mandates. But let's start with property tax key messages. Is it property tax relief or reform? We have to encourage legislators to get fiscal estimates from the Department of Management or from the Legislative Services Agency before proceeding with big system changes. The impact of multiple changes in the moving parts and components of the property tax system, whether that's valuation or rates or property tax growth, those things are very hard to predict in terms of outcomes. If reform reduces revenue, then it really is more about property tax relief. Much of the governor's version of property tax reform spares schools, and we're grateful for that. One big concern we have is the acceleration of SAVE funds to contribute to more property tax relief much faster. That negatively impacts resources available for school infrastructure, safety, and equipment. And it will take $200 million off the table within 4 years. Many districts are bonded against SAVE, so maybe put into a default situation. A reduction in SAVE requires schools to turn increasingly to more bond issues and maybe higher PEPL levies. If voters don't approve those, districts will then have to reduce SAVE that's currently spent on safety, technology, updated buses and equipment. Non-instructional software and buses, those are really expensive. So if they're paid with school general fund, that further means reduced resources, staff, maybe delaying upgrades, maybe even reducing programs for students. Remind them that policies do not change in isolation. Low SSA and declining enrollment with the state taking over the budget guarantee, that should already lower school property tax burdens for taxpayers, and they don't need to go too far with this SAVE reduction. So SSA and what's next? 88 school districts will experience a reduction in regular program district costs with a 2% SSA, and we have some UEN members in that group. The teacher salary supplement is not going to grow enough to meet all pay minimums. District salary increases can only match inflation if there are other program or staff reductions, and those are going to impact students. Encourage legislators to resist every unfunded mandate that survived the funnel deadline. And if there are mandates, we have to make sure that they carefully consider effective dates so that schools can thoughtfully implement changes, have time to plan and train staff, and consider the impact on students. Thanks to our UEN corporate sponsors. We appreciate their support and connection to UEN member school districts. Check out the corporate sponsor page on the UEN website for more information about how to access their services. If you have a company or service that you think would be supportive of UEN schools, send them our way. The UEN Advocacy Resources page has all kinds of things to help you with your advocacy when you're meeting with legislators or just reviewing what's happening at the State House. Check out that page for access to these videos, issue briefs, weekly reports, calls to action, and more. And also, this week in particular, check out the week's detailed written report for all the actions at the State House as we get through this first legislative funnel. We'll see you next week.